Welcome to Lore After Dark. Tonight we begin a slow journey into the world of Elden Ring, a place where history is broken, time feels uncertain, and truth exists only in fragments. You don't need to understand everything. You don't need to remember names. Just listen and let the world unfold. The lands between are not simply a kingdom or a continent or even a world in the traditional sense. They exist somewhere between states of being, between order and chaos, between life and death, between gods and mortals. Even the name suggests this uncertainty. The lands between are defined not by what they are, but by what they are suspended within. Long before the events of the game, the lands between were shaped by forces far beyond mortal understanding. These forces are not gods in the familiar sense. They do not rule from thrones or speak directly to their followers. They influence reality subtly, shaping laws, concepts, and beliefs, rather than issuing commands. The world of Elden Ring feels ancient because it is layered. Civilizations rise on top of ruins they barely understand. Castles are built from stone, taken from older structures. Beliefs are inherited, altered, and forgotten. Nothing begins cleanly. Everything is inherited. The land itself reflects this history. Vast fields feel quiet rather than empty. Forests seem to listen. Ruins are everywhere, not as landmarks, but as reminders. Something always existed here before you arrived. Even the sky feels heavy. Golden light filters through clouds, not warmly, but distantly, as though the sun itself is bound by rules it does not control. Day and night pass, but without comfort. Time moves forward, but it does not heal. The lands between are governed by an idea called order. But this order is not natural. It is imposed, shaped, enforced. It exists because something powerful insists that it must. Before this imposed order, the world may have existed differently. Death was once a natural part of life. Change was inevitable. Nothing lasted forever, but that was altered. Something was removed. Something essential was sealed away. And when death is removed from the world, decay does not stop. It simply loses direction. This is why the lands between feel stagnant. Not frozen, but trapped. Life continues without resolution. Souls linger. Beings exist far beyond their intended time. Even the demigods persist in broken states, unable to truly die, yet unable to truly live. The people of the lands between rarely speak of hope. They speak of duty, of grace, of obligation. Even faith feels transactional. You are guided not because you are loved, but because you are useful. Grace itself appears as faint golden light, pointing the way forward. But grace does not explain itself. It does not comfort. It only directs. It tells you where to go, not why you should want to go there. This creates a world where purpose is external, meaning is borrowed. Identity is granted, not chosen. And when that guiding force falters, everything beneath it begins to crumble. Long ago, the lands between were unified beneath a single vision of order. That vision was embodied in something called the Elden Ring. Not a physical ring, but a collection of laws, concepts, rules that governed reality itself. When that order shattered, the world did not end. It fractured. What followed was not immediate chaos, but prolonged decay. A slow unraveling. The consequences of divine conflict echoing outward through centuries. The lands between are what remain when gods fail to agree on what the world should be. Rest here for a moment. Imagine tall grass moving gently in the wind, a distant tree glowing softly against the sky, ruins standing quietly, unconcerned with who passes through them. This world does not rush you. It waits. As the imposed order settled into the lands between, it did not arrive through conquest, proclamation, or visible force. It reshaped the world quietly, altering the rules that governed existence itself. People did not awaken to a transformed reality. Instead, change unfolded so slowly that it blended into everyday life, becoming indistinguishable from what had always been. This influence came to be known as the Greater Will, not because it announced itself, but because its presence could be inferred through the systems it enforced. The Greater Will is not a god in any familiar sense. It does not love, judge, or punish. It values stability above all else. Where chaos allows possibility, the Greater Will imposes structure. Where uncertainty threatens continuity, it enforces permanence. Its influence reached the lands between through intermediaries rather than direct presence. These intermediaries were the Two Fingers, ancient and unsettling beings that served as conduits for a distant intent. They did not speak in words. Instead, they moved slowly and deliberately, their gestures interpreted by devoted readers who spent their lives attempting to understand even the smallest motion. The Two Fingers never explained purpose. They indicated direction. This ambiguity was not accidental. It ensured obedience without understanding. Those who followed believed they were aligned with something higher, even if that higher purpose was never fully revealed. Faith became habit, and habit became law. From this guidance emerged the Golden Order. More than a belief system, it became a framework for reality itself. The Golden Order defined what was natural and what was forbidden. It governed not only society, but life and death. Under its rule, death was no longer inevitable. It was removed from its proper place and sealed away. The rune of death, once an intrinsic part of existence, was extracted and hidden. Life could persist indefinitely, but only in a diminished form. Bodies endured, souls lingered, endings were denied. This was presented as mercy, but it was containment. Without death, life lost its direction. Suffering accumulated without release, and the world became stagnant rather than eternal. At the center of the system stood Queen Marika. She was chosen not for ambition, but for endurance. As the vessel of the Elden Ring, she embodied the laws that governed the world. Through her, the Greater Will anchored its order firmly to the lands between, binding divine authority to a single form. Marika was worshipped as a god, yet her divinity was obligation, not freedom. She maintained balance according to rules she did not create. Over time, the consequences of the Golden Order became impossible to ignore. The world persisted, but it could not heal. Life continued, but meaning slowly eroded beneath repetition. Alongside her existed Radagon, a warrior, a champion, and the most devoted enforcer of the Golden Order. Where Marika questioned, Radagon obeyed. Where doubt formed, he reinforced faith. Their relationship was deliberately obscured because they were not merely consorts. They were two aspects of a single being, divided in form, but united in purpose. This division reflected the conflict at the heart of the Golden Order itself. Stability opposed change. Control opposed possibility. Obedience stood against reflection. Eventually, Marika chose defiance. The shattering of the Elden Ring was not an act of chaos, but refusal. By breaking the laws that governed reality, she disrupted the Greater Will's hold over the world. The consequences were severe, but stagnation was worse. Radagon attempted to undo the damage, trying to restore what had been broken. But once the laws of existence fractured, they could not be reassembled. The Elden Ring splintered into great runes, fragments of authority scattered across the lands between. These fragments were claimed by the demigods, each inheriting immense power without unity. What followed was not immediate collapse, but prolonged decay, a world still standing, yet no longer whole, waiting beneath a distant and silent will that had not finished watching. As the Elden Ring lay shattered, its fragments scattered across the lands between, the demigods inherited not only immense power, but profound uncertainty. Each great rune carried authority, yet none carried coherence. The laws of the world still existed, but they no longer agreed with one another. Reality functioned, but unevenly, as though stitched together from mismatched principles. The demigods were not prepared for this burden. They had been raised beneath the certainty of the Golden Order, shaped by a system that promised permanence and direction. When that system fractured, each was forced to define meaning for themselves. Their responses revealed more about their inner nature than any divine lineage ever could. Godric the Grafted clung to the idea of legitimacy. Weak by birth and distant from true succession, he sought to construct worth through accumulation. Limbs were taken from the fallen and sewn onto his body, not merely to gain strength, but to simulate belonging. His castle became a monument to insecurity, filled with remnants of stolen power, bound together without harmony. Godric believed authority could be assembled, if only enough pieces were gathered. Renala of the Full Moon chose retreat. Her power was never rooted in the Erdtree, but in the stars, in ancient lunar magic untouched by the Golden Order. When Radagon departed, she did not rage or rebel. She withdrew. Her academy persisted, but her will faded. She became a ruler suspended in memory, endlessly recreating what had been lost, believing rebirth could substitute for resolution. Radon embodied endurance. He bound himself to gravity magic so he would never abandon his horse, even as his body grew impossibly large. He held back the stars themselves, freezing fate in place through sheer strength of will. His loyalty to order remained intact, even after order had abandoned him. When scarlet rot consumed his mind, his body continued to fight, driven by habit rather than purpose. Millennia represented resistance taken to its limit. Cursed from birth by rot, she refused decay through discipline and precision. Her blade became an extension of her identity, every movement controlled, every strike deliberate. She did not seek conquest, she sought mastery over her affliction. When control finally failed, the rot bloomed outward, reshaping the land. This was not triumph. It was surrender without surrendering pride. Other demigods chose paths less visible. Some hid, some schemed, some vanished entirely, abandoning a world that no longer aligned with their vision. Each carried a fragment of order, but none possessed enough to restore it. Power existed without resolution, authority without legitimacy. The Shattering War did not devastate the lands between in a single cataclysm. It eroded it slowly. Roads became unsafe. Communication collapsed. Armies decayed where they stood, unable to advance or withdraw. Faith fragmented into isolated interpretations of grace and destiny. The Erdtree remained luminous and distant, but its light no longer unified. It illuminated division instead. grace itself became selective. It withdrew from many and lingered with a few, offering direction without explanation. Those abandoned by it were not told why. They simply felt its absence, like warmth that never returned. These people came to be known as the Tarnished. They were not exiled for failure. They were discarded. Once useful, now unnecessary. Yet even in abandonment, the system remained patient. Potential was never wasted. It was merely deferred. And as the world settled into quiet ruin, something waited for its moment to be recalled. Long after the demigods had exhausted themselves and the Shattering settled into stalemate, the lands between entered a state of suspended decay. Nothing truly progressed, yet nothing fully collapsed. Castles still stood, though their halls echoed with absence. Armies remained, but without purpose. Faith endured, but fractured into countless interpretations, each clinging to fragments of a truth that no longer existed as a whole. It was during this long stagnation that grace returned to those it had once abandoned. The Tarnished, scattered across distant lands, felt the faint pull of golden light once more. This return was not framed as forgiveness or redemption. It carried no explanation, no promise. It was simply a summons. The Tarnished were called back, not because they were special, but because they were expendable. They existed outside the current order, unbound by allegiance to any demigod or doctrine. Their exile had stripped them of certainty, leaving them adaptable. In a world locked by divine stalemate, adaptability became valuable. Grace guided them with subtle insistence. It did not speak. It did not reassure. It pointed. Paths revealed themselves only briefly, like memories half remembered. The Tarnished followed, not because they believed, but because there was nothing else left to follow. Unlike the demigods, the Tarnished were allowed to die. Their deaths carried consequence, but not permanence. They returned, drawn back by grace, shaped by repetition rather than destiny. Each failure refined them, not morally, but functionally. They learned the rhythms of a broken world by existing within it. This cycle of death and return revealed something unsettling about the lands between. Mortality, once removed, had not vanished entirely. It had been redistributed. Some beings lingered endlessly, unable to end. Others were permitted to fail repeatedly until they succeeded. Death was no longer equal. It was assigned. As the Tarnished moved through the world, they encountered remnants of beliefs that predated the Golden Order. Old gods, forbidden practices, whispered truths buried beneath official doctrine. The Golden Order had not erased these things. It had merely suppressed them, sealing away what it could not reconcile. This suppression created tension beneath the surface of reality. Forces older than the greater will continued to influence the world from beyond perception. These forces did not enforce order. They embodied concepts taken to extremes: rot, frenzy, blood, night. They waited patiently for moments of weakness when imposed structure faltered. The existence of these forces revealed an uncomfortable truth. The Golden Order was not the natural state of the world. It was an overlay, a system imposed atop something older, something resistant to permanence. When the Elden Ring shattered, these buried influences began to seep upward once more. The Tarnished walked unknowingly through this tension. Each step forward disturbed ancient balances. Each rune claimed, altered the shape of possibility. They were not restoring order or destroying it. They were testing what remained. The Erdtree watched silently. Its golden light still reached outward, But it no longer guided with certainty. It observed. It waited. Its roots stretched deep into the world, entwined with histories that could not be undone. And beneath the surface of every choice, one question lingered without answer. Was the tarnished meant to repair what had been broken, or to replace it entirely? The lands between offered no response. It never had. As the tarnished moved deeper into the lands between, the nature of death revealed itself more clearly. Death here was not an ending, but a condition governed by permission. Some beings were denied it entirely, others experienced it repeatedly, and a few were claimed by forces far beyond the Erdtree's reach. Long before the Golden Order reshaped the world, death had been a natural certainty. Lives ended, souls departed, the world renewed itself through loss. This balance was broken when the rune of death was removed from the Elden Ring. Mortality did not vanish, but it lost authority. Death could occur, but it no longer concluded existence. Those touched by grace lingered after defeat, returning again and again. Others decayed slowly, bodies rotting while consciousness remained trapped within. Spirits wandered, bound to places rather than purpose. The lands between became crowded with unfinished lives, unable to move forward or fade away. This distortion created entire cultures shaped around avoidance. Burial rites lost meaning. Honor in death became symbolic rather than final. Even the concept of sacrifice changed, as giving one's life no longer guaranteed release. Death became unreliable, unpredictable, and deeply unequal. Some sought to exploit this instability. Necromantic practices emerged, not as rebellion, but adaptation. If death could no longer claim the soul properly, then the soul could be repurposed. Bodies were animated. Spirits were bound. Power was extracted from a lingering essence. These practices were condemned publicly, yet quietly tolerated, because they aligned with the Golden Order's greatest fear: waste. Other beings entered pacts with forces beyond the Erdtree. Blood rituals, madness, and rot offered alternatives to stagnation. These paths did not promise peace, but they promised change. To many trapped in endless persistence, even decay felt preferable to stillness. The concept of destined death remained hidden, guarded, and feared. It represented finality, an idea incompatible with imposed order. Those who sought it were branded heretical, not because they threatened the world, but because they threatened permanence. To allow true death was to allow the possibility of an ending. As the Tarnished continued, they encountered beings who remembered fragments of this older balance. Some whispered of a time when endings mattered. Others guarded secrets meant to remain buried. These encounters felt less like guidance and more like echoes, remnants of a world that had not survived. Even the demigods feared true death. Their power protected them from finality, but trapped them in unending conflict. Victory could not conclude the war. Defeat could not resolve it. They existed in a loop of violence without closure, sustained by a system that refused to let anything truly end. This imbalance weighed heavily on the land. Fields grew barren, not from destruction, but exhaustion. Cities hollowed out as inhabitants lingered without purpose. The sky itself seemed distant, as though the world strained beneath the weight of its own persistence. Through all of this, the Tarnished remained an anomaly, allowed to die, allowed to return, allowed to continue. This contradiction placed them between states of being, neither fully bound nor fully free. Their journey was not one of destiny, but of pressure. They moved because something had to. And with each step forward, the question of death lingered quietly beneath everything. Not how to avoid it, but whether it should be restored. The lands between did not answer. It waited. As the Tarnished moved onward, it became increasingly clear that the lands between were shaped not only by visible gods and wars, but by forces that existed far beyond the Erdtree's light. These forces did not seek worship or obedience in the same way. They influenced reality through pressure rather than command, altering existence by presence alone. These entities came to be known as the Outer Gods. They were not bound to the lands between, nor did they originate within it. Their influence seeped inward from elsewhere, drawn to imbalance, stagnation, and weakness in imposed order. Where the Golden Order enforced structure, the Outer Gods embodied singular concepts taken to their extreme. Scarlet Rot was one such influence. It did not merely decay flesh, it transformed it, reshaping bodies and landscapes alike. Rot was not destruction for its own sake. It was change without restraint. To those trapped in endless persistence, rot represented movement. Even if that movement was painful, it offered an ending that the Golden Order refused to allow. The frenzied flame embodied another response to stagnation. Where rot reshaped, frenzy erased. It sought not to rule, but to reduce everything to a single, undifferentiated state. Madness was not a side effect of this influence. It was the mechanism. Individual identity dissolved beneath overwhelming revelation, replaced by unity through annihilation. Blood, too, carried an external influence. Through blood rites and devotion, power was extracted directly from suffering. This path did not promise peace or order. It promised elevation through sacrifice, a hierarchy built not on stability, but on excess. It thrived in secrecy, feeding on desperation and resentment left behind by a rigid system. These forces did not replace the Golden Order. They pressed against it, testing its limits. Each represented a different answer to the same problem. If the world could not move forward, then it must either transform, dissolve, or collapse inward upon itself. The Golden Order responded not with understanding, but suppression. These influences were sealed away, forbidden, hidden beneath layers of doctrine and denial. But suppression did not eliminate them. It concentrated them. Pressure built beneath the surface of reality, waiting for fractures through which to emerge. The Tarnished encountered these influences not as clear choices, but as subtle deviations, a path slightly darker than the rest, a voice barely audible beneath the wind, a power that offered certainty where guidance had failed. None of these paths demanded loyalty. They tempted through inevitability. This revealed another truth about the lands between. Order was not dominant because it was strongest. It was dominant because it was persistent. It endured by outlasting alternatives, not by defeating them. When it faltered, those alternatives rushed in to fill the void. The Erdtree stood at the center of this tension, radiant, yet distant. Its light did not banish these forces. It coexisted with them, drawing boundaries that grew thinner with time. Roots reached deep into the world, intertwining with older influences the Golden Order could never fully remove. As the Tarnished continued their journey, every choice brushed against these unseen pressures. No decision existed in isolation. Every action fed one force or weakened another. Balance was no longer a natural state. It had to be imposed, resisted, or abandoned. And beneath it all, the world waited to see which pressure would finally break through. The lands between had endured imposed order, endless stagnation, and divine silence. What remained was a question without urgency, but with weight. If the world could not remain as it was, then what form would its change take? No answer came. Only movement. As the Tarnished pressed onward, the presence of the Erdtree became impossible to ignore. It was not merely a landmark, nor a symbol of faith. It was infrastructure. Its roots spread beneath the lands between like veins, threading through soil, stone, and memory. The Erdtree was less a tree and more a mechanism, sustaining the Golden Order through constant, quiet influence. Its golden light was not warmth. It did not comfort. It illuminated. Grace flowed outward from it in narrow paths, selective and deliberate. This guidance was never universal. It did not touch everyone equally. It favored those who could serve a function, those who could move the system toward resolution. Those born beneath its light were shaped by it. Their identities formed around service, obedience, and endurance. To live under the Erdtree was to exist within expectation. Even rebellion occurred within defined boundaries, rarely questioning the system itself. Yet the Erdtree did not create life. It recycled it. When beings touched by grace fell, their essence returned to the roots, absorbed and redistributed. This process was framed as sacred, but it was also efficient. Nothing was wasted. Souls did not depart. They were processed, returned to the system that had shaped them. This revelation unsettled many who had once believed the Erdtree represented salvation. To be absorbed was not transcendence, it was reuse. Individuality dissolved quietly, not violently, becoming part of something vast and impersonal. The Erdtree's dominance also obscured older forms of belief. Before its rise, the world had not been unified beneath a single symbol. Different cultures worshipped different forces. Some revered the night sky. Others honored cycles of decay and renewal. These traditions did not disappear. They were overshadowed. Beneath the Erdtree's roots, remnants of these older beliefs endured. In forgotten ruins, in forbidden texts, in practices dismissed as heretical or dangerous. These traditions remembered a time before imposed unity, when the world was allowed to change naturally, even if that change was painful. The Tarnished encountered signs of resistance, not through armies or revolutions, but through absence. Empty churches, broken statues, shrines reclaimed by nature. These places did not rage against the Erdtree. They simply existed outside its attention. This absence was revealing. The Golden Order did not eliminate alternatives because it could not fully perceive them. It focused on maintaining itself, not understanding what lay beyond its influence. What it could not categorize, it ignored. The Erdtree itself showed signs of strain. Its light dimmed in places, its roots twisted unnaturally around ancient structures. The world beneath it no longer aligned cleanly with the order it enforced. Growth continued, but without harmony. As the Tarnished drew closer to the Erdtree's domain, resistance increased. Guardians appeared, barriers formed, access became restricted. Not out of fear, but preservation. The system defended itself instinctively, attempting to prevent disruption without acknowledging its cause. This behavior revealed something essential. The Golden Order was no longer guiding the world toward stability. It was preserving itself. The Erdtree had become less a symbol of balance and more a monument to persistence. And in its shadow, the Tarnished continued forward, carrying uncertainty rather than purpose, moving not because they were chosen, but because the world could no longer remain untouched. The Erdtree did not welcome them. It watched. As the Tarnished moved closer to the heart of the lands between, the concept of fate began to surface more clearly. Fate here was not prophecy in the traditional sense. It was alignment, a convergence of forces pressing events toward outcomes that felt inevitable, even when they were resisted. The stars once governed this flow. Long before the Erdtree's dominance, the movement of the heavens shaped destiny. The constellations guided kings, wars, and eras. To study the stars was to study possibility itself. Fate was distant, impersonal, and vast. Its relationship was severed when the stars were halted. Radon's act of holding back the heavens was not symbolic. It was literal. Fate itself stalled. The world ceased to progress along its natural trajectory and instead looped within itself. Causes repeated. Consequences lingered without resolution. The lands between became trapped in a prolonged present, unable to move forward or return to what had been. This interruption revealed the fragility of imposed order. The Golden Order relied on motion it could not fully control. When fate stalled, guidance lost coherence. Grace still pointed the way, but its certainty weakened. Direction remained, but destination blurred. Those who studied sorcery felt this shift most acutely. Magic drawn from the stars no longer flowed freely. Knowledge stagnated. Insight turned inward. What could not advance began to fold back upon itself, creating practices that focused on reflection rather than discovery. The Tarnished encountered individuals who clung to fragments of celestial truth. They spoke of destinies deferred, of futures waiting beyond reach. Their words carried longing rather than faith. They did not seek restoration of the old order. They sought release from suspension. This stasis affected identity as well. Without fate to pull them forward, beings defined themselves through repetition. Warriors fought the same battles endlessly. Guardians remained at posts long after purpose faded. Even monsters followed patterns worn smooth by time. The world did not decay through destruction. It decayed through familiarity. In places untouched by grace, the sky appeared different. The stars seemed closer. Night carried depth rather than absence. These regions felt older, not because they were ancient, but because they were less constrained. They remembered motion. The Erdtree's influence could not fully reach these spaces. Its light dimmed. Its authority weakened. Here, fate whispered again, softly, uncertain, but alive. Possibility returned, not as promise, but as discomfort. The Tarnished felt this contrast intuitively. Paths diverged, choices felt heavier, outcomes less predictable. This uncertainty was not hostile. It was simply unfamiliar to a world shaped by guidance. As the Tarnished continued, it became clear that restoring motion would require confrontation, not only with gods and demigods, but with the concept of control itself. Fate could not be resumed without surrendering certainty. Progress demanded risk. The lands between did not fear change. It had been denied it for too long. And somewhere beyond the halted stars, time waited patiently, unbroken, watching for the moment it would be allowed to move again. As the Tarnished moved through regions shaped by fading fate and weakened grace, the idea of choice began to surface more clearly. Not choice as freedom, but choice as consequence. In the lands between, decisions rarely created new paths. They shifted pressure from one force to another, redistributing imbalance rather than resolving it. This was most evident in the nature of allegiance. To follow grace was to align with imposed order. To reject it was not rebellion, but exposure. Outside its guidance, the world offered no reassurance, only uncertainty. Many beings remained loyal to the Golden Order not out of belief, but familiarity. It was easier to endure a known system than to face the absence of structure. Yet the Golden Order no longer functioned as intended. It guided without clarity, enforced without harmony. Its symbols persisted, but their meaning had thinned. Rituals were repeated long after their purpose was forgotten. Obedience became habit, stripped of conviction. The Tarnished encountered followers of order who could no longer explain why they served. Knights guarded empty halls, clerics tended shrines no one visited. Sentinels watched roads that led nowhere. Their devotion had outlived relevance, sustained by repetition rather than faith. Elsewhere, rejection of order took quieter forms. Individuals withdrew rather than resisted. They hid in forgotten places, choosing obscurity over alignment. These figures did not seek power or change. They sought absence. To exist unnoticed was the only way to remain untouched by competing forces. This withdrawal revealed something essential. The lands between did not demand loyalty from everyone. It only demanded compliance from those who mattered to the system. Those who existed at the margins were tolerated because they posed no threat to persistence. Power in this world was defined by visibility. The Tarnished could not remain unseen. Their movement altered the balance simply by occurring. Every victory disrupted stagnation. Every defeat reinforced it. Progress, even when unintended, carried weight. This pressure extended to identity itself. The Tarnished was not defined by lineage, belief, or destiny. They were defined by continuation. They moved because movement was required. Meaning accumulated not through intention, but through persistence. As the journey continued, it became clear that endings were feared, not because they destroyed order, but because they made judgment unavoidable. A finished story invites evaluation. An unfinished one can endure indefinitely without scrutiny. The Golden Order thrived in incompletion. It preserved the world in a state that could never be assessed fully. Without an ending, failure could not be declared. This was the quiet tragedy of the lands between. It existed in a permanent state of postponement. Decisions delayed, conclusions deferred, responsibility displaced onto systems that no longer functioned. The Tarnished moved through this unresolved world not as a savior, but as a catalyst. Their presence forced interactions that had long been avoided. Paths crossed, conflicts resumed, questions surfaced that could not be ignored forever. Yet even now, certainty remained elusive. Every choice carried cost without clarity. Every alignment solved one problem while deepening another. Balance was not something to be achieved. It was something to be negotiated endlessly. The lands between did not offer resolution freely. It resisted finality with quiet persistence. And as the Tarnished continued forward, the world adjusted around them, not to welcome change, but to accommodate it just enough to survive. As the Tarnished drew nearer to the center of power within the lands between, the idea of rulership began to take shape, not as leadership, but as occupation. To rule this world was not to guide it toward prosperity or peace. It was to sit within its machinery and ensure that something, anything, continued to function. The throne did not represent victory. It represented responsibility without clarity. Those who once sought power did so, believing it would grant meaning. Yet every figure who reached toward authority discovered the same truth. Power did not simplify the world. It made its contradictions unavoidable. To rule was to inherit every unresolved tension left behind by the Golden Order and its collapse. The demigods had failed not because they lacked strength, but because strength alone could not reconcile a broken system. Each attempted to impose their own interpretation of order. Each effort deepened fragmentation. Authority multiplied, but coherence vanished. The Tarnished approached this legacy without inheritance. They carried no established doctrine, no divine mandate beyond faint guidance. This absence made them adaptable, but it also made them dangerous. They were not bound by precedent. They could choose continuity, alteration, or erasure. This possibility unsettled the remaining structures of power. Guardians intensified. Barriers tightened. The world resisted intrusion not out of malice, but preservation. Systems under threat seek to maintain themselves, even when they no longer serve their original purpose. The concept of an Elden Lord persisted despite this decay, not because it promised restoration, but because it offered completion. An Elden Lord would occupy the throne and close the open circuit left by the Shattering. Whether the result would be healing or further stagnation was secondary. What mattered was closure. This desire for closure extended beyond gods and institutions. The land itself seemed strained by incompletion. Ruins lingered without resolution. Conflicts repeated without conclusion. Even the Erdtree's light appeared exhausted, illuminating without inspiring. The Tarnished felt the weight of this expectation. Their journey was no longer about survival or discovery. It became a question of acceptance. Would they accept the burden of a system that could not be repaired, only maintained? Or would they reject it, knowing rejection carried consequences that could not be undone? In this moment, the illusion of choice became clear. There was no path without cost. There was no outcome without loss. Even refusal was a decision with impact. This realization stripped the journey of heroism. The Tarnished was not destined to save the world. They were positioned to decide how it would persist, or whether persistence itself was worth preserving. The lands between did not beg for salvation. It did not plead for destruction. It waited, strained beneath accumulated history, ready to adapt to whatever pressure replaced what had failed. The throne stood empty, not because no one could claim it, but because no one could resolve what it represented. And as the Tarnished continued forward, the shape of the world narrowed. Possibility condensed. Whatever came next would not be reversible. The lands between had endured uncertainty long enough. As the Tarnished moved through the final layers of the lands between, the nature of endings became impossible to ignore. Endings here were not conclusions. They were reorganizations. Nothing truly vanished. It merely changed position within the structure of existence. The paths available to the Tarnished reflected this truth. Each represented not a victory, but a philosophy, a way of interpreting the failure of the Golden Order and deciding what should replace it, or whether replacement was even possible. To reinforce the existing order was to accept its flaws as necessary. To become Elden Lord under the current system meant restoring the mechanisms that had already proven insufficient. Stability would return, but stagnation would remain embedded within it. The world would persist, unchanged in its fundamental nature, repeating familiar cycles beneath renewed authority. Other paths offered alteration rather than preservation. They sought to reshape the laws that governed reality, introducing new principles in place of old ones. These changes promised movement, but not certainty. Alteration carried risk, because new systems had no history to temper them. What replaced the Golden Order might resolve one imbalance while creating others, yet unseen. Some endings embraced severance. They rejected imposed structure entirely, allowing the world to exist without central authority. This did not guarantee freedom or harmony. It simply removed enforcement. In such a world, meaning would no longer be assigned. It would have to be discovered or endure absence. There were also paths that sought finality through erasure, to reduce all things to a single state, to eliminate difference, suffering, and uncertainty by collapsing existence into uniformity. These endings promised peace through absence, rest through dissolution. They offered an end to conflict by removing the conditions that allowed conflict to exist at all. None of these possibilities were presented as correct. The lands between did not judge them. It did not reward virtue or punish doubt. It responded only to pressure. Whatever force replaced the Golden Order would shape reality until it, too, weakened. This revealed a deeper truth about the world. It was never designed to reach perfection. It was designed to continue. Systems rose not because they were right, but because they endured long enough to replace what came before. The Tarnished stood not as a hero, but as an instrument of transition. Their significance lay not in identity, but in timing. They arrived when the world could no longer sustain itself, unchanged. Even now, the remnants of the Golden Order resisted disappearance. Symbols lingered. Rituals persisted. Faith continued out of habit. Change did not erase the past. It layered itself atop it. The lands between would remember whatever came next, just as it remembered everything before. Ruins would form. Stories would fracture. Meaning would blur with time. Nothing chosen here would remain pure. And yet, something had to be chosen, because a world suspended indefinitely could not endure forever. As the Tarnished approached the deepest point of authority within the lands between, the nature of divinity revealed itself in an unfamiliar form. There was no throne room filled with gods, no council of voices debating fate. Instead, there was something quieter, more distant, a presence that did not rule through will, but through enforcement. This presence took shape as the Elden Beast. Despite its appearance, the Elden Beast was not a god in the way mortals understand gods. It did not demand worship. It did not speak prophecy. It did not explain itself. It existed as a manifestation of law, given form so that law could act directly upon the world. The Elden Beast was the physical embodiment of the Elden Ring itself. Not its power, but its function. Where the greater will existed as distant intent, the Elden Beast existed as execution. It enforced order not because it believed in it, but because enforcement was its nature. This distinction is important. The Elden Beast did not choose the Golden Order. It did not create its rules. It simply upheld whatever structure was placed within the Elden Ring. It was indifferent to the outcome as long as coherence remained. This explains its silence. Speech implies persuasion. Persuasion implies doubt. The Elden Beast did not need agreement. It required compliance. Its presence was not meant to be understood, only endured. To stand before it was not to face judgment, but an inevitability. The form it took reflected this purpose. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and impersonal. It did not react with anger or fear. It responded to disruption as a system responds to error. Corrective force was applied without emotion. In this way, the Elden Beast revealed the final truth of the Golden Order. The system had never been about harmony or prosperity. It had been about maintenance, about preserving a configuration of reality long past the point of usefulness. The Erdtree, the fingers, the demigods, even Marika herself had all been components within this system. Each played a role. Each was replaceable. None were essential beyond their function. The Tarnished, standing at the center of this machinery, represented something the system could not account for, not because they were powerful, but because they were undefined. They did not originate from within the Golden Order. They were not shaped by its expectations. Their presence introduced uncertainty where enforcement expected predictability. This is why the confrontation mattered, not as a battle of strength, but as a collision between continuation and disruption. The Elden Beast did not defend itself out of self-interest. It defended the integrity of structure. If it fell, the system it enforced would lose its final anchor. Yet even this confrontation did not promise resolution. Defeating enforcement did not erase intent. The greater will remained distant. Other forces waited beyond perception. Removing one mechanism did not guarantee freedom. It merely created space. This space was fragile. Without enforcement, order could dissolve. Without structure, meaning would have to emerge organically, shaped by experience rather than decree. The world would no longer be preserved by default. It would have to justify its own continuation. The Elden Beast did not resist this possibility out of fear. It resisted because resistance was its purpose. When enforcement ends, systems either adapt or collapse. The lands between stood at that threshold, and for the first time since the Shattering, the shape of reality was no longer predetermined by the past. With the machinery of imposed order exposed, the lands between could finally be understood for what it had always been. Not a world seeking salvation, nor one doomed to ruin, but a place shaped by competing interpretations of meaning. Every force that touched it believed itself necessary. Every system insisted it alone could endure. The Golden Order believed meaning came from structure, from permanence, from rules that prevented uncertainty. It offered predictability in exchange for stagnation. In doing so, it removed risk, but also removed growth. Life persisted, but rarely changed. History accumulated without resolution. The outer gods believed meaning came from extremity, from surrender to a single principle taken to its limit, rot transformed, frenzy erased, blood exalted. These paths rejected balance entirely, offering clarity through excess. They did not preserve the world. They consumed it in order to reshape it or end it outright. The Tarnished stood apart from these forces not because they were neutral, but because they were unfinished. They were not bound to a single philosophy. Their identity was defined by movement, by exposure to contradiction, by endurance through uncertainty. They did not represent a solution. They represented possibility. This is the quiet core of Elden Ring's world. It is not a story about victory. It is a story about continuation, about what it means to exist after certainty collapses. The game does not ask which ending is correct. It asks whether any system can remain just once it becomes absolute. Every choice offered to the Tarnished reflects this question. Reinforce order and preserve a flawed world. Alter it and accept unforeseen consequences. Abandon it and risk meaning dissolving entirely. None of these outcomes are framed as triumphs. They are framed as responses. The Lands Between does not reward moral clarity. It responds to pressure. Whatever force replaces what came before will shape reality until it too hardens into doctrine. Then it will fracture. Then something else will rise. This cycle is not presented as tragedy. It is presented as inevitability. The world was never meant to reach a final state. It was meant to change, to decay, to be reinterpreted endlessly by those who passed through it. Gods attempted to freeze this motion. Mortals suffered the consequences. When the system failed, mortals were asked to decide what came next, without guidance. This absence of guidance is intentional, meaning in Elden Ring is not given. It is constructed through persistence, through existing within uncertainty without demanding resolution, through accepting that no structure can remain benevolent once it refuses to change. The Lands Between endures not because it is stable, but because it adapts. Even stagnation is temporary. Even collapse creates space for something else to emerge. The world continues because it has never been finished. And as the Tarnished moves forward, their journey dissolves into the landscape. Not as legend, not as prophecy, but as another layer of history settling quietly into place. The Erdtree's light fades into memory. The stars resume their distant motion. Old forces withdraw. New pressures gather. Nothing ends. It simply becomes part of what follows.